The 71-year-old died in hospital after a cardiac arrest at his home in Florida. He took a series of WWE titles in the 80s and 90s and also appeared in movies. More recently, he's been seen making speeches at Donald Trump's rallies in the US.
Let Trumpomania make America great again!
In the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 76 points at 91.38. The pound buys $1.35 and €1.14. LBC weather, light rain in the northwest tonight, turning dry in the southeast, a low of 7 degrees. From Global's newsroom, for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 3 minutes past 8 on LBC. Welcome to the show if you've just joined us. We'll be streaming this hour if you'd like to watch us on Global Player or the LBC app. Do you remember those halcyon days back in, 2020, 2021, when Nadine Dorries was Culture Secretary? And she introduced the online safety bill into Parliament and got a lot of criticism, particularly from her own side over it. People saying, well, this is just the nanny state. This will have no impact on people's lives. It's just the government interfering in people's freedom to look at what they want on the internet, etc., etc. She stuck with it, as I say, in the face of opposition, well, from a lot of people, not just on the right, actually. She then quit when Liz Truss became Prime Minister in 2022, and the bill proceeded to go through Parliament. And today it became an actual act of Parliament, and it comes into force today. So I want to look at what these new rules are, what impact they're going to have, not just on children, but also wider society in general, and whether you think that really 4 or 5 years on from the introduction of the bill, it actually went far enough. What would you like to see the current government do to strengthen it? 0345 6060 973. Well, Andy Burrows joins me in the studio for the hour. He's Chief Executive of the charity the Molly Rose Foundation, which focuses on young people's mental health. And Andy, welcome. Now, you're going to take some calls from our listeners later in the hour, but just to explain what the Molly Rose Foundation is.
Yeah, it's great to be with you, Iain. So Molly Rose Foundation was established by the family and friends of Molly Russell after her death back in 2017. And I'm sure lots of your listeners will remember Molly's case. At her inquest, the coroner ruled that the amount of harmful content that she saw on social media platforms, specifically Instagram and Pinterest, contributed to her death. So we now work to campaign for a safer online world. You know, ultimately, we shouldn't be losing preventable young lives, like in Molly's case, and to provide support and education to children who are affected by online harms and poor mental health.
So take us through some of the measures that are coming in tomorrow under this Act. How will ordinary people notice what they are?
Well, tomorrow is a really important day because this is the day when the provisions relating to children and children's safety start to come into force. All of us will notice those because platforms will have to start checking the ages of users. Now, if we're talking about, for example, pornographic websites or X that allows a lot of pornographic content on there, that means that anyone using that platform that wants to access that content will have to go through an identity check to prove whether or not you're over 18. But all other social media platforms will also have to start looking to see if a user is a child. So that means we might be prompted to start to say, you know, actually, the platform thinks that we might be a child. Are you? How old are you? And that's really important because, you know...
And the child says 18.
Well, so
How's that going to work?
This will be the test tomorrow because, what we need to see is if the platforms are going to do this in a way that works, in a way that ensures that if a user is under 18, then they are not able to access content that Parliament has agreed is harmful. And if they are under 18, that we know, there's a big difference between a 13-year-old and a 17-year-old. And one of the things that the Act needs to do is make sure that children, of various ages in that group are getting a safer, more age-appropriate experience.
I use Twitter X a lot. I haven't seen one warning on the platform to say, well, from tomorrow, you're going to have to prove your identity. I was about to say it's incredibly surprising, but in the case of X, perhaps it's not. Some platforms, some dating apps, for example, have been issuing prompts to users over the last few weeks to get them ready for this change. Dating apps will have to have. Why would a dating... Well, like Tinder, you mean?
Like Tinder, for example, because we know, for example, that children have used those types of sites before, and then we've seen cases of child sexual abuse take place on those platforms. So these rules apply to any platform that allows user-to-user communication. So this is social media platforms, it is gaming platforms, it's also the likes of dating sites as well.
But what if a company, I've got no idea where Tinder's based, but let's pick something that isn't actually real. Say there was a Bulgarian dating app that was based in Sofia, but people all over the world use a lot in this country. Would that come under the remit of this Act?
So the way in which the Act has been designed is that any platform, any service is in the scope of the legislation if it's available to UK users. So yes, it would be. Clearly, when we're talking about companies that are based outside of the UK, there is a challenge there. And the Act does provide powers for Ofcom to go after senior managers of those firms. That applies more to some of the larger companies, but also in extreme cases for Ofcom to go to the courts and to seek an injunction to get those services blocked from the UK. Now, that isn't something that we'd be seeing on a day-to-day basis, and we shouldn't be, because obviously there's free expression concerns there. A high threshold has to be met. But if we're talking about really appalling sites that just fail to follow the rules, and there are examples of that, one of the sites that is really problematic and really concern to many of us is a pro-suicide forum that we know is linked to at least 99 deaths in the UK. Now, I don't think any of us expect that tomorrow that platform will suddenly start to comply with the rules. Almost certainly, we will need to see Ofcom take that case to the courts to get that blocked.
But what about, there are huge numbers now of pornography sites that you don't have to pay for. They're completely free. You can just log on and watch as much porn as you want. And how does the legislation cope with that? Because I can't imagine that all of these sites are going to comply with the legislation.
So, ultimately,
People are now thinking, how does he know that?
Ofcom is going to face a real challenge here, because there will be lots of platforms, and I think the regulator is going to have to come out of the blocks very quickly and make clear that there will be consequences, there will be enforcement action for platforms that don't play the rules. But I think inevitably, because there are so many platforms in scope, the regulator is going to have to prioritise. It's going to have to go after those sites that are the highest harm, that are the most used sites. And so, I expect a lot of focus in the next few days, thinking not just about porn sites here, but particularly around the big social networks, the big gaming platforms, to see if they are age gating, introducing these age checks, but also doing lots of things under the bonnet to try and make sure that the experience is safer.
What's the experience of other countries? Have other countries done this already? Are we copying them, or are we a world leader in this?
Well, the UK Yes and no is the answer. So when the Online Safety Bill was first introduced to Parliament, the UK was very much the leader in this. But because of just how long it took to get that legislation onto the statute book, we have now seen other countries, other jurisdictions start to catch up. So in the EU, for example, there's a very significant legislation called the Digital Services Act. We're seeing in Ireland, which takes a big role because so many of the American companies have their European headquarters in Ireland, that their scheme has just gone live. There's measures in Australia, lots of individual states in the US as well. But let's be clear, I think, that the UK, along with the EU, really are at the forefront. And so for the tech companies, the UK is very much a precedent. And, if they can game the legislation, if they can challenge the legislation here, that's going to be watched very closely internationally.
Let's move on to what you think ought to be in this Act and it isn't included, and why isn't it included? So what would you like to have seen the government do that they haven't done?
Well, we are concerned that the Act that was passed was not strong enough, and also that the way in which Ofcom has implemented its powers really has demonstrated timidity where we need to see ambition. And so our big concern, here at Molly Rose Foundation, we've got a very clear test for the legislation. Will it do everything that is possible to stop more deaths like Molly's? And the reason that is so important, Iain, is because we know that in the UK, we lose a young person to suicide, aged 10 to 19, every week where technology plays a role. And of course, this is just one of so many harms that we know take place and are accelerated by the negligence very often of social media platforms. Now, we've seen Ofcom set out measures that platforms will have to take to stop, for example, algorithmically recommending large amounts of harmful content like the suicide and self-harm material that Molly saw. But the measures are just incredibly weak. They are incredibly weak, and we see them really as more of a sticking plaster than a comprehensive solution. When you go into the detail of what Ofcom is telling companies to do, Ofcom estimates that the large companies will have to spend about £80,000 to fix the algorithms that cost Molly's life. Now, if we walked over Waterloo Bridge 10 minutes down the road, people in the advertising industry tell me that is less than Meta is currently paying to advertise on the front of the IMAX cinema there. So, this is pocket money for these platforms, and we really are sceptical about whether the ambition that Ofcom is showing is going to translate into anything more than really a sticking plaster.
And regulators are only ever powerful if they have the powers to implement the rules. We've seen this with Ofwat, the water regulator. Does Ofcom really have enough teeth?
Ofcom has the powers. It's whether it is prepared to use them. And I think our assessments at Molly Rose Foundation, and I think the assessment that is held widely across civil society, is that Ofcom has pulled punches here. So rather than display the ambition, the boldness that is necessary to take on the scale of these problems, some of the largest companies in the world, they've drawn up the proposals in a way that really do feel quite meek and quite timid. And it feels as if the regulator's been paying far too much attention to the risk of being sued by these companies, of it getting dragged down in the courts, rather than, starting from where I think lots of us would want to see, which is, will these rules go far enough? And I think certainly in my experience, when I talk to the big companies, the Metas, the TikToks of the world, when you talk about the Online Safety Act here in the UK, compared to, for example, where Brussels is going with its proposals, it's very clear they sit up and take much more notice of what's happening over the channel than they are with what Ofcom is doing.
Right, we're going to hear a lot more from Andy Burrows in a minute. We'll also be taking your calls. If you've got questions about how this Act will operate, if you've got questions about how to protect your own children online, Andy's very happy to answer them. He'll be able to answer them much better than I can assure you. But I think this is every parent's worst nightmare, when you discover that your child, emphasise child, has been looking necessarily just at pornographic sites, but the kind of sites that Andy was talking about, these suicide sites, sites that encourage people to bully other children, for example. And I think bullying online, and not just in person, is one of the really difficult problems of our time. Because at least if somebody's doing it in person, you kind of know who they are. I've told this story before, but somebody quite close to me who was, I think, 12, 13, after 6 months found out that it was her own best friend that was bullying her online. How do you cope psychologically with that? Because it's got to have an effect on you, hasn't it? I mean, I don't think you can ever stop this sort of thing happening, but you can at least mitigate it and try and protect as many people as you can. I think it's very easy to pretend that there are simple solutions to this. If only the government would get off its backside. I'm not sure it's that simple. So we'd love to hear from you in the next few minutes, well, in fact, right up to 9 o'clock on this issue. 0345 6060 973. 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Iain Dale on LBC.
Andy Burrows is with me, Chief Executive of the Molly Rose Foundation. We're talking about the Online Safety Act. And I'm wondering whether this is going to be one of those acts that has to have a second act following very quickly, a bit like there was Leveson and then Leveson 2. I mean, it's a very, very different area. But the problem, I think, with regulating things on the internet is that the technology and the ability of people who code these things is often years ahead of the legislation, and there's no way that legislators are ever going to catch up. All they can do is do their best. And I'm wondering almost whether there ought to be a sort of annual revision of the Online Safety Act.
I think that's absolutely right, in the same way as we have, a crime and justice bill most parliamentary sessions. We will need to do that because, as you say, the technology is changing all the time. We also know that this is going to be a cat and mouse game, and some of the big platforms will do everything they can to game the rules. It's also the case that when the Online Safety Act was passed, it was quite significantly watered down in those turbulent political times. Well, at the time, obviously, we had a Conservative government. The now leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, described the act as legislating for hurt feelings. So we saw some quite significant delays, parts of the act being dropped. It was really a question of this legislation limping towards the finishing line rather than, being able to strengthen it and bolster it and plug gaps at the time. So, the act we've got is a starting point, but it is an imperfect starting point. And one of the things that, we've said very clearly to Peter Kyle, who himself has described the legislation as uneven and unsatisfactory. And when Ian Russell and I met with the Prime Minister earlier on in the year, the same message, it's time for the Prime Minister to finish the job and strengthen the act, because I think this is one of those issues that, clearly resonates with every single parent up and down the country with children who are using smartphones, who are using social media platforms. And I think it's also, at a time when we know that governments around the world need to show that they can make a meaningful, tangible difference to our lives. Here is a classic example of where I think families will cheer on any political party that wants to take these issues seriously and, really decisively make things better.
So you think there are votes in this?
I think there are votes in this. Whenever we speak to parents, whenever we've polled parents, the last time we polled parents a few months ago, 85% of parents want to see a stronger Online Safety Act, and about 90% of those thought that this Labour government should introduce that in the next parliamentary session. I think this is one of those issues when, parents, when all of us are looking at the harms that children are facing, when we look at just, how readily solvable lots of them are, how we could be expecting the tech companies to be doing so much more to just make their platforms safe, really safe by design, they should get on and do it.
I've just remembered a conversation, I think it was on the radio, that I had with a leading Conservative commentator, and it was 3 or 4 years ago, so this legislation was clearly going through at the time. And this person said to me, yeah, but what about all of the men that won't register for pornography sites because they won't want their details being made, well, no, I don't think that any of these companies are going to make them public, but it's quite something for someone to, I suppose, admit that they watch pornography. So therefore, his thought process was, well, they're going to think this is the nanny state gone mad, and it's sort of ruining ruining their ability to use pornography in the way that they had done before. Now, I'm not suggesting that anybody should get an onion out of their pocket and have any great sympathy with that, but I mean, I suppose maybe that's a bit of an explanation as to why it was watered down a little bit, that people thought, well, we don't want to impact on people too much.
So there are big issues at stake here. How we balance the safety of children, the safety of all of us as adults, versus privacy, versus free expression. No one should pretend that they are easy trade-offs to make. There's some really difficult balancing to be done, and some really important conversations about where we as a society want to draw those lines. Now, I think what hasn't always been helpful is that some of the debates around this Act have been quite shrill. There have been claims made about what the Act will do or won't do, about, the risks, for example, as you were talking there about pornography sites, of privacy leaks, or of, Ashley Madison-style leaks, when, actually the way in which the Act is designed is that...
I remember the name Ashley Madison, but I can't remember what it was.
So that was a large-scale leak of users of a site that I believe was kind of specialising in adultery, right. So if you wanted to find an affair. The way in which Ofcom has designed this legislation is that if you have to prove that you are 18 to use, for example, a pornographic website, or when, the platform has reasons to think that it's a child user and they want to determine the age of that child, there's quite clear guidance about how that should be done. And if you're talking, for example, about a site where you need to prove that you are 18, you will go through a check, but that is to determine whether you are 18 or not. So the only thing that the platform will get is that the account registered with them is 18, yes or no. It doesn't contain, other personal details other than you might have put in to open that account in the first place.
So how does it work? Do you have to register for each site, or are you registering with a sort of overarching company that feeds the information back to all of the sites? So
right now, I think most sites are going their own way. I think, over time, perhaps we will start to see in the way that, for example, you only have to register once to use government services, to pay your tax and things. Maybe we will start to see that. But right now...
Well, that'd be quite a lucrative new business, pornservices.co.uk.
What we expect to see, there's a range of ways in which age verification and age assurance is going to be done, but probably the most standard way will be that you will be asked to take a video selfie, and that uses age estimation technology. It's actually, incredibly accurate now. So if you, kind of are claiming to be an age that's substantially different from the age that you are, the technology will pick that up and then ask you to provide, some other form of ID. That's, really important thinking, for example, about child sexual abusers that might, kind of lie about their age and claim to be a child, for example.
But there were some very, very, very clever 13, 14, 15-year-olds who may well find ways to get round this. I've got a question here from Bernie who says, on the web and control, how does using a VPN circumvent the Act's intention? That's a very private network. Can you circumvent it with things like that?
Well, Bernie's absolutely right. There will be ways that children will find a way to get around these rules. And, a VPN is one way that,
Because most parents wouldn't have a clue, would they?
Most parents will not have a clue. So this is not a magic bullet. There will be ways around this. But I think, what we also know is that very often children are stumbling across some of this content before perhaps they're going out to look at it. So it's not a magic bullet. It will not work 100%. But I think those of us who, work in this space and want to see a safer online world for children will say, yes, it's not 100%, but it will make a difference.
Isn't that at the crux of this, though, that you're getting children in primary school who might have smartphones and one person sees a clip wherever, they forward it on, gets forwarded on. This Act is not going to impact on that at all, is it?
It won't in terms of private messaging, and that's because private messages and encrypted sites like WhatsApp or Signal, for example, they are largely out of scope of the legislation, and this is one of those classic examples of where privacy meets safety, and the decision that the government took was that private messaging apps will be out of scope. Now, from a safety point of view, that is problematic because we know, for example, that child sexual abuse is rampant on those platforms. If you take a site like Telegram, for example, or Signal, even WhatsApp, we know that those have really significant problems with illegal activity like child sexual abuse. There are limitations to the way that this Act has been designed in terms of what this will deliver.
Patrick says, I've had a few prompts. One was hugely impressive. I needed a 3D scan to check my age. What does that involve?
Yeah, so this is where you will be asked to, record a short video. Perhaps you're asked to kind of like move your face to the left and the right, and so that determines, one, are you a real person, and two, then it's using this technology to then be able to assess your age, and it's actually incredibly reliable now. It's something like 99% reliable.
And Patrick continues, in other sites, I just put I was born in the 1950s and it let me in. I'm 32. The same issue with buying weapons online. It's basically a tick box, but hopefully these are just teething problems.
Well, now we're going to need to see Ofcom monitor this really closely. And this isn't just about 18, of course. It's also about 13, which is, the joining age for all of the big social media platforms. But let's face it, that's been a joke for many years because anyone will know that, most children by the time they get to 11 or 12 will be on all of the big social media platforms. They'll be on, the Snapchats, the TikToks, the Facebooks of the world. So it's really important that this is working at 13 as well as 18, and that if platforms, are going to flout the rules, if they are going to continue with that tick box that Patrick was talking about, that Ofcom needs to come down quickly.
Right, we'll be taking your calls in a moment, so let's fill up the switchboard, 0345 6060 973. Obviously, I want to hear from parents on this because I suspect a lot of you find this subject quite difficult, and I think in a sense, it's a bit like AI, where you know you should be interested in it, you know that it's relevant to your life, but you kind of want it to go away. And therefore, I wonder how many of you have been listening to the conversation over the last half an hour. And I thought, I've got to take this seriously. Well, you've got an expert here to ask questions to and also give your views, your experiences as well. Because I think anybody that's had an experience, or maybe an unfortunate experience in this, where you found out that your 13-year-old is looking at sites that they shouldn't be, what on earth do you do? How do you even open the conversation with the 13-year-old about it? And how do you prevent it from happening again? Because there can be, as we know, tragic consequences if things are handled wrongly. I say things handled wrongly. I mean, I don't know if there is a right way to handle these things. I guess it depends on the child. It depends on the parents. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:32 news headlines on LBC with Daryl Jackson.
Sir Keir Starmer says he'll hold emergency talks with France and Germany tomorrow because the situation in Gaza has reached new depths. The Prime Minister's statement also admits it's hard to see a hopeful future as aid agencies warn of malnourished children and ceasefire talks stall. Essex police have arrested 16 people following protests outside a migrant hotel in Epping. A dispersal order has come into force outside the Bell Hotel this afternoon and designated demonstration areas have been put in place. A father's been found guilty of the murder of his 2-week-old son in a special care baby unit in Somerset. 27-year-old Daniel Gunter inflicted catastrophic injuries to Brendan Stadden in March last year. LBC weather, light rain in the northwest tonight, turning dry in the southeast, a low of 7 degrees.
LBC. Iain Dale. Text 84850. This is LBC.
8:35. Andy Burrows is here, Chief Executive of the charity, the Molly Rose Foundation, which focuses on young people's mental health. And just want to explain, because there are people tuning in all the time, why the foundation was set up.
Yeah, so we were established by the family and friends of Molly Russell, who was 14 when she died, after being exposed to just a torrent of toxic suicide and self-harm and depression material online. So I think lots of your listeners will be familiar with Molly's case and with the incredible campaigning that her father Iain has done over many years to really shine a spotlight on the harm that takes place online. We know that Molly, for example, was recommended at least 2,000 posts relating to suicide and self-harm in the 6 months before she died. Now, that was back in 2017, but I can tell you from the research that we've done, from the monitoring that we do every single day, that if you go on to TikTok, if you go on to Instagram, very quickly those algorithms will take you down the rabbit hole and start showing you just the most appalling content that I think any parent would be horrified to think that, their child could very, very quickly be exposed to.
In your opinion, could the likes of Facebook, TikTok, Instagram Could they stop this happening overnight just by changing algorithms?
Absolutely. So, we work...
Why can't the law force them to do that?
We, work very closely with a whistleblower from Meta called Arturo Bahar, and Arturo headed up their child safety team for many years. And, he is clear, knowing Mark Zuckerberg, knowing the individuals involved and knowing that product better than virtually anybody, that if Mark Zuckerberg wanted this to happen, it could happen, in a matter of weeks. The reality is that just for far too long, child safety has been an optional extra for these companies. The usual ways in which we could get companies to do better, the kind of reputational levers, they just haven't worked in this space because, we all use those platforms, whether we like them or not, we still use them. And so ultimately, it is only going to be regulation and strong regulation that makes these companies change their ways. And, very often, I think we look at this probably, with a comparison to something like big tobacco, where, we saw a long, drawn-out fight to get to the point that then cigarettes were regulated. And, right now, the tech companies are engaged in a tussle to try and delay, I think, the inevitable, which is that we will regulate these platforms and recognise that, the harms they cause, which stem from the business models, it stems from their commercial strategies, it stems from a lack of emphasis on product safety. These are all entirely preventable harms that stem from the decisions taken in Silicon Valley.
Right, let's go to Terry in Bournemouth. Terry, hi.
Hello, Ian.
Hi. Oh, you've got a lot of noise going on there.
I'm sorry, I'm just unpacking my mum's shopping. Sorry, it's not a very funny subject to be talking about, so I'll cut the humour. But I'm completely and utterly in support of what your guest is saying. We've really got to protect these kids. It must be the only business in the world where you can literally do whatever you want and allow abuse. And, honestly, they're just getting away with it. And the analogy of tobacco is spot on. But the other thing I was going to say was, what I heard earlier is describing potentially kids would need to maybe make a video to log on with to check that they were old enough. But what about AI and deep fake? It's not going to take kids long to ask one of these, I don't want to say a brand name, but surely, make me look older, please, in my video. And I think it's just going to fail. We need something stronger.
Yeah, so, Terry is absolutely right. For too long, the platforms have been able to get away with this. And, for better or worse, being online is a fundamental part of children's lives. And when you think about, the risks that children face in the physical world, if children go to a playground, the council has to make sure that, it is safe. There's not going to be a health and safety incident. If we take our kids to the pool, there's going to be a lifeguard there. And yet, when they go online, some of those basic safeguarding measures just haven't been in place. And, it's a really important challenge about the technology is moving on. AI is coming on. Deep fakes are coming on. And so that's precisely why, to the point that you were making earlier, Ian, we're going to need to come back and review this legislation regularly. And as the technology changes, as, there'll be new ways for people to be able to evade the rules, then we'll need to come back and make sure that as technology changes, the protections are changing and improving too.
OK, Terry, thank you very much in that. Keep unpacking your mum's shopping. She'll be very grateful. This is from Tony. Does the concern with harmful websites mask the more cogent concern that the amount of time youngsters spend on their phones, oblivious to their social and ecological surroundings, is the real issue? I don't think it is the real issue, but it is an issue, isn't it?
It's really important to say that, when children are online, they can be doing good, productive things online, or they can be watching the same brain rot that lots of us as adults will be watching. So this isn't just about how long a child is spending online, but it's about, are they having a good, safe, age-appropriate experience? The reality, though, is that, the amount of time being spent online is one of the factors that can cause a child to come to harm. But actually, if a child is spending half an hour a day on a platform like TikTok and being bombarded with the types of content that Molly was seeing, half an hour a day over weeks and months is going to be enough to have a really serious impact on their mental health and their well-being if they're seeing the types of material that we know that they can be exposed to. So for us at Molly Rose Foundation, the real priority is about making sure that these platforms, the social networks, are safe and age appropriate for children to use, because there is a lot of good on tech, and very often we are rightly focusing on the bad. But if we can get that harm out of the way and then start to think about safer, better, more age appropriate experiences, there's a prize there.
How much is addiction a problem here? Because when I go home on the train each night, I'm on the train for 45 minutes, and I'm listening to a podcast usually, and while I'm doing that, I'm scrolling through Facebook Reels, and I've got addicted to Jack Russell Facebook Reels. A very harmless pursuit, I think, but I can't wait for the next one to appear. And I mean, there are obviously other things like West Ham staff, and then these sort of AI boyfriend and girlfriend things that seem to pop up with increasing regularity. And you think, well, and before you know it, 45 minutes have gone. And there's something that happens in your brain. I don't know whether it's some sort of chemical that is triggered, but you kind of want more of it.
We all get the dopamine hit when we go on social media. And, in a sense, some of those big social media platforms, have been designed in a way that are designed to keep us addicted. They're designed to keep us on there for as long as possible. And this,
what I don't understand is why Jimmy Carr keeps appearing, because I can't stand him.
Yeah, algorithms can cause a lot of harm in serious ways, and then in that way. Ultimately, the way in which these platforms are designed, the way in which the Silicon Valley tech execs, the way in which Wall Street judges the success of these companies is by metrics. How much time are users spending on the platform? When a new feature is introduced, like, say, Instagram Stories, does that mean that we're spending longer on the app, that we're keeping eyeballs on screens for longer? And, that's a problem for all of us as adults. I'm as guilty of that as you are. But the problem is that, the Instagrams, the TikToks of the world are targeting children in exactly the same way, with features that are designed to keep eyeballs on screen for as long as possible.
Let's go to Kat in Midhurst in West Sussex. Kat, very good evening. What would you like to say?
Hello, thanks for taking my call. Yes, because of the compulsive nature, the sort of obsessive tendencies they encourage, the addictiveness, and apart from the sort of general overwhelm from too much information and the anxiety that we know more and more is happening for young children these days, I would really like to see the government actually getting to the point where they're saying that it's illegal for children under the age of 16 to access smartphones. And I would really hope that as a society we can actually start getting to a point where we can sort of help parents generally by us all realising that the last sort of 10 to 15 years has been a sort of an experiment, which we can now see the damage that it's doing. And that just as in the 1980s, we would pop children on the back seat of our car and not think of anything about them, needing to be in a child seat. And that over time, we now just take those things for granted, that it's not safe to have a child in a car without a child seat. That we reach a stage over the next few months and years where we can sort of talk together as a society to say, children that are under the age of 16, they shouldn't be on the internet. We don't want them online. There's so many other things for them to do. And just as we wouldn't hand a cigarette to a child in our own home and let them have a drag, most parents wouldn't anyway, that actually legislation to say it's illegal would be the way forward to sort of protect young children, because I feel that we've done a really poor job of looking after young children over the last 10 to 15 years with the access to the online material. So,
well, Kat, the reaction from many people to what you've just said, it's the nanny state gone mad.
Well, I'm sure they probably said that about seatbelts. Well,
yeah, I did. I was totally against seatbelts, and just before the Act came in, I had a head-on crash at 50 miles an hour. That rather converted me.
So we've got smoking. People obviously would have thought that was the nanny state. And then we've even had more recently smoking in pubs. Oh, no, that's the nanny state. But we know it's the right thing. And it's the same with seatbelts in the backs of cars with children, and we've got to look after their young minds. Children have such malleable, vulnerable minds, and it's just we aren't looking after them. That's what I feel. And Smartphone Free Childhood, that's a brilliant organisation which is doing great work. You can get a parents pact, learn about other parents as well, find out about other parents who are actually interested in trying to. A friend of mine does it with her child, a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. There's a group of them that have actually agreed not to sort of go down the smartphone route. And when they get to senior school, let's go for dumb phones. Let's it's going to take a little while, but I think we've reached a point now where we could actually change things.
Kat, thank you very much. Andy, that would be quite a radical thing for any political party to propose, ban smartphones until 16. But, I mean, there's a certain logic in what Kat was saying there.
Well, look, I think Kat speaks for so many parents who just, have started to feel quite fatalistic about this, because we've seen so many years in which action has not been taken, and in which we just see successive governments not standing up to the tech companies. But, when we saw the risks of cars, we didn't ban cars, we introduced seatbelts. We made sure that there were good safety measures in place. And, here at Molly Rose Foundation, I totally understand the calls for bans. I totally understand the frustration and the fear that parents have that's leading them to say that. We wouldn't support that, though, because, firstly, that is really punishing children for the failures of politicians and tech companies to make the product safe by design. There's also just a whole slew of unintended consequences that could come from that. So, the harms on social media, I mean, heavens, they are profound, and we need to see the platforms be brought to heel. But we also know that, for lots of children with poor mental health, for children that might be exploring their sexuality, for children who feel lonely, they can also be, a lifeline. So there's advantages as well as harms to social media today. We see the opportunity to legislate, to regulate, so that these platforms are fundamentally safe by design. So children's safety, but also children's well-being is then built into how these products are run. And I think, there's an optimistic case for what the future can look like. Think about a world where the YouTubes of the world, and so many parents with young children, will use YouTube to keep their parents entertained, when they're cooking dinner or whatever it might be. Think of a world in which YouTube, for example, was mandated to start showing high quality content. Maybe that was children's content from public service broadcasters. There's a world in which we can be not only making these platforms safe, but also actually better educational products.
In a way, we should pay tribute to YouTube, because generally it is a very safe platform, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't have pornography on it.
It has risks, but, they have invested in making
I don't think I've ever come across a video on YouTube that I was thinking, hang on a minute, that shouldn't be there.
Any platform that has an algorithm comes with risks, and we know particularly on the kind of the short form version of YouTube that that there are problems with harmful content there. But you're right. I mean, YouTube is not a TikTok, for example.
That is very true. I must admit, I don't use TikTok, even though I do have a TikTok account. But anyway, right, we're going to take more calls on this subject of safety online, particularly for children. How is it affecting young people's mental health? It's 10 to 9 on LBC.
LBC This Morning on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
We're looking ahead to events tomorrow when, of course, that doctor strike will take place. The doctors are saying that they believe that they still have the majority of public support. Do you support them? Lucy's in Muswell Hill.
100% support.
Really?
Yes. I think that they had a significant pay increase last year, which was fully justified.
Nigel's in Temple Fortune.
I think it's an absolute total disgrace, nearly 30% in a number of years. They have a duty to protect people.
Nick Ferrari at Breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio, on Global Player, and the new LBC app. Iain Dale on LBC.
8:52. Kay is in Redbridge. Hello, Kay.
Hello, Ian. Thanks for taking my call. Hello to you both. You said if we had any questions, we should call in.
Yeah.
So I'd love some advice. Husband and I disagree about this, but basically we have children on the spectrum, one of whom is now 16. They haven't had a smartphone the whole time. They did have a dumb phone, got bullied at school for it. Obviously, at 18, they'll be able to have what they like, and we won't be able to say anything. I'm kind of arguing that we should get them a phone now and kind of, it's our phone, we're allowing you to use it, try and, help them to use it safely. But the question is there anything extra that we can be doing to keep them safe? Because, they are so impressionable. They can find things that they see traumatic if they see the wrong thing. They won't regulate the amount of time that they're on there, and they can become so easily addicted to screens.
Hi, Kay.
Hi.
I can really relate to this. I've got a nephew with autism, and the risks of the online world. We know for anyone with SEND who's a young person, are really heightened. But at the same time, it can be a great way for for children with autism and other conditions to be able to express themselves on gaming platforms, for example. So it's such a hard balance, and I completely understand why you're kind of struggling with what's the right thing to do. I think ultimately you'll know your child best, so you'll know kind of if it's the right time to go and get them a smartphone. I think if you do decide to do that, then there's fantastic resources that are out there. If you go to, for example, Internet Matters or NSPCC, there's really, really great resources about what you can do to work with your teenager to help to keep them safe, to make sure they've got the best account settings on there. And this is a process. It's not an event. So if you do decide to do that, then actually my advice is always just the most simple advice I can give. It's to then have regular conversations. So work out what kind of how they would use the phone. Are you going to set time limits? How are you going to do that? But then, make this a part of the regular conversation. So, when you're sat having dinner in the evening, talk about what they are doing online, talk about what they're seeing, take an interest. And I think then, if you're working together in partnership, it means that they can, start to explore the online world, but also, know that they can come to you. And if they see something, for example, that is harmful or upsets them, they know that they can come to you and talk and kind of work it through together. It's a really difficult balancing act, so I can understand why it's such a hard decision to do. But, it sounds like you're absolutely thinking through these issues.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Alison, who's a new caller in Plymouth. Hello, Alison.
Hello there. Yep. I'm going back probably 15 years now, when my daughter was a mental health nurse student. And I know she asked me to do a bit of digging around for an assignment that she was doing on eating disorders. And I was absolutely horrified at what was online available as far as how to become a bulimic, how to become anorexic. I don't know what the answer is. I have no idea. But as far as, Molly's case was concerned and the horrific stuff that she was able to access of how to commit suicide, I just find the whole thing, I'm certainly not a communist, but I begin to wonder whether the Chinese have the right idea where, there is no Facebook, there is no TikTok.
And, Alison, I think, I can completely relate to that, because it's one thing to hear about the toxic content that is available online that children get recommended. And then when you see it, the types of eating disorder content that you've seen, lots of just the incredibly disturbing content that it's so easy to come across. It is repugnant, and it's material that, for example, you couldn't go and show on the television because, there's a broadcasting code, but children can be on a device, on a tablet, on a smartphone, and not only be able to access that, but to be recommended it at scale. The heart of this is that this is a business decision that is being taken by the likes of Mark Zuckerberg to build their product in a way that is prioritising showing more content that they think a young person wants to see. And that judgment is purely based on, perhaps they've seen it once or twice and then they will be bombarded with it. It's a commercial decision, and we should all be outraged that, for far too long, Silicon Valley has been able to make those value judgments about our children and put our children in harm's way.
And I just think that, the more that I hear about this, and, I've got grandchildren of 6 and 8 and up to 13, where does this leave them? And how do you police it? There's all sorts of, suggestions about, discussing things that they've seen online. But if they're seeing something online that they know that, isn't something that you're going to discuss at the dinner table, what sort of effect does that have on them? I just think,
OK. Alison, we've reached the end of the hour. Thank you for being our final call, and thank you to Andy for giving us so much wise advice and great information over the course of the last hour on safety online. I'm sure we'll return to this subject in the future. If you've been troubled by anything that you've heard over the past hour and want to talk to someone about what you're feeling and thinking, you can, of course, always phone the Samaritans at any time of the day or night, and it won't cost you a penny to do so. You can email Joe, that's Jo, @samaritans.org, or you can call 116123. That's 116123. Now, coming up in the next hour, did you know that from next season, football fans will be able to drink alcohol in the stands during Women's Super League games at Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool, Manchester City and Manchester United? I bet you didn't. But if you want to drink as a football fan at Premier League games at Chelsea, Arsenal, Liverpool, Manchester City and Manchester United, you won't be able to. Now, why on earth would that be? Why is it acceptable to drink alcohol at a Women's Super League game and not at a Premier League game? I think this is going to spark a wider discussion on how consuming alcohol is considered acceptable in a way that smoking cigarettes is not. Do we need to reevaluate that?
On your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the Prime Minister says he'll hold emergency talks with France and Germany tomorrow after a fresh round of Gaza's ceasefire talks failed to make a breakthrough. Sir Keir Starmer says the suffering and starvation in the territory has reached new depths. Hamza Yousaf, the former Scottish First